Michelle Caruana from Play Cafe Academy and Profitable Play. And in this video, we are going to continue with a theme that not only do I think is so important and so top of mind for small business owners everywhere, especially local service-based or retail-based business owners, but something that has been so well received by both you and my Playmaker Society members. So last week on my YouTube channel, I posted a clip of the guest expert interview that I did with Michele Dillinger, who really helps small business owners focus on attracting, hiring, and retaining the best possible employees or the best possible fit for their business. And in the previous clip that I shared and in the previous guest expert interview that I did, which you can watch in full if you're a Playmaker Society member, and if you want to learn more about joining, that is linked in the description of this video. But we really talked about that attracting and hiring and retaining part. But what we didn't really get into was what happens when things go awry. So what happens if an employee is not meeting their deadlines or not performing the tasks that are expected of them? How do you know if it's your I don't want to say your fault, but how do you know it's you as the manager who is failing to clearly communicate these tasks? How can we bridge that gap? And what happens if we unfortunately need to come to the realization that we need to terminate somebody's employment? How do we go about that conversation? What are some helpful things to include? And how do we communicate with the rest of our team? Because even though so many people are working remote these days, us who run local service-based businesses are still managing people that interact with each other every single day. So how do you communicate? How do you answer questions? How do you respectfully explain a situation of needing to terminate somebody without being a gossip or without undermining your employee's capability or fueling rumors in your company? And how do you prevent that snowball effect of one person quitting turning into 5 people quitting? So we are going to talk about a bunch of those topics in today's clip. But again, if you'd like to watch this full 2-parter guest expert training, you can head to the video description and learn more about Play Cafe Academy and my membership Playmaker Society. So without further ado, here is Michele Dillinger. All right, thank you so much for joining me again, Michele. I'm very excited for this part 2. So just in case anyone didn't watch part 1, first of all, if you missed it, definitely go back and watch it. But if anyone's just kind of tuning in and hasn't met Michele yet, do you want to go ahead and just get started by letting us know who you are and who you serve?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be back with you today for, like you said, part 2. I am Michele Dillinger, and I help small business owners with recruitment and retainment, as well as creating positive and intentional company cultures. So I'm so excited to get started and jump right in.
All right, so in the previous part, we talked about attracting and retaining employees and things like that. And today we're going to kind of dive into when that goes awry, because that's one of the things that we as retail owners deal with the most is employee turnover and all that good stuff. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started by talking about an employee that is maybe not working up to their potential, or let's start with a specific scenario. So let's say this person was given a list of tasks and they're consistently either not communicating about it or they're not completing their work on time. How do we kind of address this? And what's the best way to go about that?
Sure. So the first thing you want to make sure you're doing is you want to make sure that the expectations for the job are clear. So you want to make sure that this employee isn't underperforming because they don't understand what their job responsibilities are, or because there's some confusion related to what they're supposed to be completing. So first, we just want to make sure that it's not us as managers, supervisors, or owners who are causing this problem because of lack of clear expectations. If, however, you're sure that there is a lack or there is clarity around that individual's job responsibilities, the next thing you want to do is try to get to the root of the problem. So let's say, for example, you have an employee who is chronically late to work. You want to have a conversation with that employee. You want it to be clear. You want it to be private. And the goal of that conversation should be to get to the root cause of that issue. So, for example, if an employee is chronically late to work, maybe you find out during that conversation that that employee has to drop off a child at daycare prior to coming in for the day. The daycare doesn't open until 15 minutes before that employee is supposed to get to work, but it takes 30 minutes for them to get from daycare to your store or your office. So those types of root causes can be really easily identified and hopefully fixed if you start with that conversation about the root cause. Another example might be, let's say you have an individual who has a so maybe has is dyslexic, and you realize that their tasks are all in written format. So you've given them an instruction manual and you say, read this, process this, this is your task list of things you need to accomplish every day. Well, maybe that employee is struggling working through a task list that's written, and you can again really easily address that underperformance issue by having a verbal conversation with that employee. So I think first we want to uncover the root cause of the problem. The next thing you want to do is develop a solution if possible. So, again, in a situation where an employee is late to work chronically because of a time constraint, or where you can change the way an individual's tasks are delivered to them, those are areas where you can solve that problem and you don't have to resort to letting that individual go. Of course, their problems aren't always going to be easily solvable, but you're not going to know that until you have that conversation. Part of that conversation, and what you really want to make sure that you're doing in that conversation, is asking straightforward questions. You don't want to beat around the bush. You don't want to be passive aggressive. You don't want to drop hints in your conversation and hope that your employee picks up on that. You want to say something really clear, like, I've seen that you're not hitting these targets that we've set. What do you think is the root cause of that? Or why do you think that might be? And the other thing you want to do is make sure that you are offering a solution that is driven by either you, the owner, manager, or supervisor. So you don't want to necessarily say to somebody, let's say, who has routinely forgotten to do a task, you don't want to say, what are we going to do? What are we going to do so that you remember? You want to really make it an I statement. What can I do to help you remember? Or what can I do to make this easier on you? What can I do to help you hit this target that isn't currently being met? So clarity, getting to the root cause of the issue, and making sure that you offer opportunities for that employee to improve are all things you want to do before you even make the decision to fire an employee.
Awesome. And just to definitely reiterate what you're saying, but in a specific example, I had an employee that kind of was almost exactly what you said, and they were chronically forgetting tasks. And I probably didn't go about it in the best way, but it did work out in the end, and I learned from it. And she said almost exactly what you were kind of stating, that the expectations were not clear. There was no checklist, there was no dates or times or order. So the problem was that I wasn't prioritizing her tasks correctly, because a lot of times in our environments, there are must do tasks and then there are nice to have tasks. So, like deep cleaning things that don't necessarily need to get done every day, but are important for, general maintenance. And in my head, I had a priority list, and in her head, she had a different priority list. And even though there was a master checklist, it wasn't clear, it wasn't in order, there was no accountability. So, for example, it was just a checklist. So people weren't putting initials. We weren't sure who was doing what and when. And I think that's a really good example of how it can go awry and how things can not be clear. And I let this build up for, I think it was like months, shamefully. This was right when we opened, and we were still kind of figuring out like what tasks could even fit in a shift because some days were busier than others. It wasn't like when you go into an office and you have complete control almost of your day. It was completely dependent on the volume of customers, the number of times the phone rang. So I think that's a perfect example of an employee and a manager being on completely different pages. And again, I let it build. I was resentful. She was resentful because, I was constantly texting her, like, why isn't this getting done? But she didn't understand what the problem was. So just to give you an example, so we ended up implementing a better task management tool. So we use Asana, which is ASANA. I always recommend it in my programs because it not only has timestamps and you can prioritize and you can set conditional tasks. So once this gets done, this gets assigned or this gets bumped to the list. And you can also add team members and track, okay, who's doing what. If a deadline was missed, you can run a report and say, okay, 8 out of the last 10 deadlines were missed or something like that. And to me, having that all in black and white really took a lot of the emotion out of the equation. And it wasn't so much about, this person's performance or this person's capability. It was like, oh, well, this task only got done 2 out of the last 10 shifts. It's all right there in black and white. There's no gray area. There was no room for misinterpretation. So implementing that tool was a huge saver for us, but unfortunately I had to learn that one the hard way.
Well, and I think what you said about making sure that it's all there in black and white and taking the emotion out of it is so important because you also want to make sure that you don't have any confirmation bias as you're going into this conversation. Like you said, it built up for months and months and months, and you were constantly frustrated that this employee wasn't performing to the level that you needed them to perform at. And I think sometimes that confirmation bias can build up to such an extent that then if the employee is, say, late one day or misses something else one day, it can start to change our own perception of that employee's performance and say, oh, they're just always missing deadlines or they're always forgetting to do tasks. But if it's there in black and white, you can really see very clearly where the employee is falling short and where they're exceeding expectations. The other thing that's really good for is documenting. So if you do end up in a situation where you do need to terminate an employee, you have that documentation already built in. So you know exactly what tasks were missed, what dates they were missed, and you have that all, like you said, in black and white, so that if there are any sort of legal questions around that employee's termination, you have that documented there. And another great benefit of having that all documented is it can help your own decision-making process. So as you're going through that process of deciding whether or not it's worth it to keep an employee or to terminate that individual, you can say, okay, this person, maybe I feel like this person is underperforming, but I can actually see that out of their 10 tasks, they're getting 8 of them done right every single time. And that can really help you evaluate, okay, are my expectations unrealistic? Am I expecting too much of an individual? And you can do that cost benefit analysis of keeping that employee versus terminating them and having to go through the process of finding and training someone new.
Well, that wraps up part 2 of my conversation with Michele Dillinger, who helps business owners attract, hire, and retain their best employees. And again, don't forget, this is just a small clip of the value-packed 2 guest expert interviews she did exclusively for my Playmakers Society members. So if you have any questions about joining or if you want to learn more, my Instagram is linked in the episode or in the video description. All of my courses and programs and my website are also linked. So I hope to hear from you and I hope to welcome you inside as a Playmaker someday. All right, have a great day. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a video. Bye now.